Hi, my name is Hannah, and today we will interview Hugo Augusto Monteiro Machado. Based in Lisbon, Portugal, Hugo is an economist. Today, he gives us his view on key trends as we emerge into post-pandemic world.
This podcast channel is about you, successful international entrepreneurs, successful expats, successful investors. Sponsored by HCJ.tax. Good morning, Hugo. How are you this morning?
Good morning. I'm fine. I'm fine. A
Great.
bit depressed about thinking about this topic you're going to present us, right?
Yeah, I'm looking forward to this conversation. So, just to provide context to those who are listening or watching, I met Hugo last Friday and we had an amazing conversation. So, I thought, you know what? Let's continue this conversation on the podcast because I think many people would be open and perhaps would benefit from the ideas that we're bouncing back and forth. So that's a context. So, for those who may be watching or listening, could you introduce yourself, please?
Sure. My name is Hugo Machado. I live in Portugal. I have a nursing degree, a master's in economic and public policies. Public policies and economics. And I'm doing my PhD in development studies. I may start by saying I'm sorry if my English is not perfect English. But like we all do when we are not from an English-speaking country, we tend to approach it to our own language and make our own version of it. So please do correct me, Derren, if I do something like that.
No problem at all. Thank you for sharing your time. Thank you. At such short notice as well. So, just to step back and in a way to begin, but continue from what we were discussing last Friday, things are changing. Things are changing. So, as you sit here, both as a Portugal citizen as well as a citizen of Europe, what do you see are the key trends that are worth paying attention to from your perspective?
Okay. So, I think the first question that when I started reflecting about this when we spoke was from where to start, a post-pandemic world. So where does this post-pandemic world start? Is there a schedule? Is it after 2 years, after 20 years? Is the vaccine the great moment when we'll start changing everything? Is it that changing point, the vaccination? Because I understood that many people see the existence of the vaccine as a changing point for that post-pandemic world.
Yeah.
And this raises some questions. As topics, I thought about speaking about health. I gave this next title, I'm not sure if it's correct, but I called it Biological Warfare.
Wow.
Geography, environment, digitalization, traveling, politics, economics, and I think it's very important always to have this in mind, individual perceptions.
Okay.
So I gathered a few topics on all of this. So I hope it's coherent thought.
Yeah.
For people to accompany us.
Yeah, sure. And the point that you made before you listed those topics, that's interesting because that's right. There's some people who say, hold on, these changes started happening before this pandemic. So the pandemic may act as a catalyst. And then there's some people who will take the opposite point of view that they're saying, you know what, everything is on pause right now. Once we get the vaccine, once everything gets settled, then the new period of time will begin. And then there's some people that are saying, no, the new period has begun right now. So everybody has a different perspective depending on where they sit, what their jobs are, etc. So that is a very valid point. So again, I guess starting with your list, let's go. Health. What are your thoughts?
So About change, you said something very important. Some people consider this change that is coming as something very sudden.
Yeah.
You know, other people consider it that it's going to be a continuation. So these two perspectives are also very important to mention. So about health, what have I written here? So as we know, this pandemic is affecting all of us, but those dying are the most aged ones. So the first question, which is possible, is, will it affect life expectancy? So are we going to see a reduction? Because this might give us a sense of how severe it was, the pandemic, effectively. If life expectancy does not change, it does not get reduced, probably it wasn't that severe. This can be done with this pandemic because we know it's more lethal with elder people. The second point that is going to leave us affected, like any major social event in history, is mental disorders.
Wow, yeah.
We know that in certain points of when society changes, and this differs from country to country, those generations, probably many individuals will be affected. Whether is a change on a political regime, whether is a big migration, whatever happens, a natural disaster, we know that mental disorders are going to enlarge in the next years connected to this.
Yeah.
Can't say how much, we can't say if it will really affect or not society, but it's something that is very present in the idea of everyone. Also, there is some doubt that health political decisions related to health have been based on what was learned in history.
Yeah.
You wrote something very interesting on this, that many of the politics that were now implemented have been implemented for more than a century. So supposedly there's some history, some background to which we can grab on. But I have a doubt. Maybe you can talk on this better than I can do. If politicians were fast enough to look behind and say, what happened before? What did we do then? Because it's history. Supposedly, it already had some evaluation.
Yeah.
What can we do now? Do you feel there was this evaluation, this historical evaluation to make decisions?
Gosh, it's there. I don't know whether the present group of politicians did that. And then even if they did, I wonder to what extent are they comparable? Because again, the numbers in terms of mortality, they're constantly being revised, right? As you know, because I guess because the medical practitioners may have been under a lot of pressure, and maybe in terms of determining the cause of mortality and what's going on right now, mistakes may have been made. And I say mistakes because, like, for example, in the US, the Centers for Disease Control, they are revising the numbers constantly, and they're revising them downwards, as in the UK. And I saw the same in Italy. So when it first happened, the numbers in Italy looked scary and huge. But then a few months later, the Italian government came by and said, well, you know, we may have made some statistical miscalculations and the number is much smaller. So as the numbers continue to go down, it compares very differently from, let's say the Spanish flu. In you know, the so-called, I know it didn't start in Spain, but the so-called Spanish flu from the First World War, where the mortality rates appear I mean, again, we don't know what statistical errors they may have made too. They appear to be higher. So back then, we saw that those economies or those cities that closed down faster, their economic and social recoveries were faster. And whereas those cities or regions that took a longer time to take decisive action, the longer term impact, both in terms of the health of their citizens as well as economic activity, they took a longer time to recover. Now, what we're seeing right now from, again, everything is preliminary. There's a lot of, in the US, they're paying a lot of attention to Sweden, as well as to a less extent Switzerland, because these are two relatively advanced economies that decided, for whatever reason, against a total lockdown. Schools continued, people went to work, there were gatherings and parks and, even nightclubs, I understand, in Zurich and whatever. And yes, there was a slowdown in Sweden because, to a large extent, the Swedish economy is dependent on export. So demand for their products by other countries that shut down were down, but their downturn was less than other advanced economies in Europe. So, and then in terms of mortality rates, my understanding, and again, these numbers are still in a state of flux, I guess, that the spike in terms of unfortunate deaths was not as much as was expected. And that's the same, again, I only know the English-speaking world. Both the UK and the US, they were going on two models, the Imperial model and the Oxford model. And both of them foresaw huge numbers of deaths, scary, huge numbers of deaths. And the health economists that were responsible, epidemiologists that were responsible for those statistical models, as time progressed, they revised them downwards. Now, as I understand, politicians aren't even referring to those models anymore, because they just seem to be disconnected to reality in the sense that the number of deaths, fortunately, was much lower. So I say all of that to answer the question. These are my thoughts, that even if a politician or a group of politicians was comparing to the past, there may be limited applicability, at least in the Western world. Now, in Asia, it's different because, unfortunately, there have been recent pandemics in Asia, and quite recent. So in Singapore and Hong Kong, for example, this was not a surprise to them. And they had plans in place at a governmental level, and they just pulled it out. They wiped off the dust, because the last one was 2011, 2012. So it was not even 10 years ago. And they just went straight into their protocols, and they did not hesitate. And I saw it with Australia and New Zealand as well. Of course, China did it as well. So the jury is still out. Obviously, the mortality rates were really, really, really low. And in some Asian countries, there was zero mortalities. I'm thinking like Vietnam and stuff like that. So that's as low as it can get, zero. But going back to your point about mental health, I guess, again, this will be the subject of perhaps a longitudinal study that we'll need to wait to understand. But just anecdotally, it has been, I know so many people who have within their network experiences of they know people who experience depression or, unfortunately, suicide because of the mental stress of being locked up at home alone, losing their jobs, seeing their businesses collapse, their entire life's work, or for multi-generational businesses, a business that their grandfather, their grandparents started, their parents, and they have seen, especially in the hospitality industry, they lost everything. A friend of mine is ex-military, and he's in his 40s, like myself, and he's ex-Australian military, and he is not a soft guy. He's a tough guy. And yet, when he had to do quarantine, because he's traveling from one place to the other, and the government in this Asian country, you're required to be isolated in a hotel room. And it got to him, and he said he wouldn't wish it on his worst enemy. So these aren't necessarily, people with, well, I'm not a mental health expert, but these aren't necessarily people who were perhaps pre-existing conditions in the sense that they were prone to mental illness. As far as I'm aware, I don't know. But it just seems that, at least anecdotally, again, this is not statistically valid, that there will be, as we come out of this, as we continue to move forward, the number of instances of mental health challenges would be getting higher and higher. This is just my perception. Do you know what you think?
Well, I agree with all that you said.
Yeah.
I'm just going to add up because you brought the models,
Yeah.
which is very important because models were made.
Yeah.
And this is important to be said. Models were made really goodly. They were really good. They were made. But like all models, they depend on the input you make.
Exactly. Yeah.
So when you have no information on to make to where to start from, so they did you can say scary, I think, because a lot of people were scared. Scary models, but and this is an opinion. Maybe it was best to expect the worst and prepare for the worst, and it wasn't that bad. Then happening the opposite. Of course, these models still don't. For example, there's an example I always used to say, which is about Africa. Which is models, informations that we have now, is that those more affected, those who die from COVID, generally, those more at risk, are more than 70 years.
Yeah.
Okay. So when you think of Africa, you always think low access to health services, low access to medicine, but you don't think about life expectancy. So when you think of, for example, Mozambique, which has a life expectancy a little bit above 60 years,
okay.
If you consider this, you might understand why death rates probably are going to be very low in Mozambique. Simply because you don't reach that age.
Right.
All this information has to be locally asserted and included in those models. So it's not enough for you to know there are this and this number of ICU units, this and this number of beds. You also have to adapt the type of population that you have, if you have correct information on the type of population. Because I believe in many places you can't really do local models because you don't have that information. But the fact that these models were so exaggerated, the results of them were so exaggerated, might make us doubt them the following times. A bit like polls, when you start hearing polls, and then the elections are always different from the polls, you start doubting polls, although they have techniques to be made. Most of them, I'm sure, are very well executed. They still have a margin of error. So, but this doubt in models, especially in scientific community, might be something bad that we earn for the future, especially in health planning. Okay? And I think we saw some of that from the swine flu, because everybody was expecting much worse. And I think our generations inherited a little bit of that. But also, I think things that were made during the swine flu.
Mhm.
It was 10, 20 years ago between that interval. So they should have been applied immediately because they worked then.
Mhm.
And at least in Portugal, I think I still question myself
Mhm.
because it's not been like a generation gap, it's 10, 15 years.
Mhm.
So why wasn't the answer more close to what
Mhm.
we did back then?
Mhm.
Because right now it's much closer. So
Mhm.
in the beginning, we should have started immediately there. Like
Mhm.
China, like you said, they had a recent experience, they picked it up and let's start here.
Mhm.
Okay, if it's too much, we won't do that. But
Mhm.
let's start there. And I didn't feel the political decision makers giving that jump start immediately.
Mhm.
Okay, but just to finish the health topic,
Yeah.
I had more these thoughts on it
Mhm.
that we have to consider for our future. The increase in chronic disease.
Mhm.
We have no idea right now if there is going to be an impact or not in the increase of chronic disease in young people that were infected by the virus.
Mhm.
There are still many things we still don't know
Mhm.
about the virus. I understood, for example, recently that several countries are having very several approach to tests,
Mhm.
not only in how you do testing,
Mhm.
but if you're infected, in using testing as a determination of cure.
Mhm.
So, and still, testing is not providing us a good enough answer
Mhm.
to ensure the status of that person.
Mhm.
Right now, the only way you can prove that someone has been reinfected by the virus
Mhm.
in opposition with the virus staying in your body for a long period of time
Yeah. Yeah.
is if you detect two different strains.
Mhm.
So
Mhm.
you still don't know how long our body will stay with the virus. And this is very important if you want the virus to disappear. Because if it stays for 6 months, 1 year in my body,
Mhm.
I'm simply going to transmit it probably
Mhm.
at a low rate, at a high rate, depending on how my body reacts. But we still don't know this. A year hasn't passed.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah. So on that point, you're right. I think I've seen like someone who was getting tested in Australia, and they took a picture of the packaging that was given to them, and it did, in the fine print, apparently, allegedly, it did say that the results may be inaccurate. It may be inaccurate because they're different types of tests. And we're still learning a lot about the virus, and there's some things we don't know. Yeah,
And you're taking a sample,
yeah, yeah.
and it's not like blood. Blood is running all over our body, it's mixing, it's liquid. So
Mhm.
you're taking a sample of something which is solid.
Yeah, yeah.
And this is important. So
Mhm.
our confidence in tests has to be low.
Mhm.
So we have to have an open thought on them, on what's going to happen. We have to trust them, of course, because it's the instrument we have, but we can't see them as the ideal answer for this.
Mhm. And sorry, and one point, the point you made about public confidence. Now, one of the differences I've observed between Asia and the West is that Asia, there's a relatively high trust in government. So if the government says something, people don't question too much. Whereas in the West, especially in the Anglo-Saxon world, there's an inherent distrust of government. So so there's a lot of more pushback from the population when the government does say something. And if it is, and we don't know what's going to happen, but if it is that the models were definitely wrong, and therefore some of the political decisions weren't the right ones, then the population will be less likely to pay attention because I'm sure this will happen again, when it happens again, because they'll look back and say, well, you said this and it didn't happen. So I think it would perhaps damage the relationship potentially between populations and their decision makers going forward. But anyway, sorry, go ahead.
we have to be honest. If someone in your family die,
Yeah.
you'll say we should have done the Chinese model.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
If someone in your family loses its job on
Mm-hmm.
this company, you say we had to choose the Sweden model.
Yep.
Which is understandable.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Because there's no good solution.
Mm-hmm.
There's no. We have to choose this one that seems best for that moment. Finally, for health,
Yeah.
another idea which I really wouldn't get on because of the Portuguese, the way in the health system is built, is the reduction of cash flow to private hospitals and how this may impact the future of health companies. I say the Portuguese model is different because we have a very supportive public system, but in countries that depend on private systems, the fact that not only by the disease itself, but by people getting scared go to use the services, this means a reduction of income, of cash flow.
Yeah.
How can those systems, which are privately supported, keep up to what they intended to do previously? Okay. Let's go to biological warfare, or do you want to say something to wrap up health?
No. Biological warfare. That sounds really a provocative title. So I'm quite curious. Yeah.
It is, because one of the things that you've listened to very commonly was that the virus was created. You know, that someone had a purpose for the virus, and there was a human purpose for this. Because I think purpose, more than invention, it's the word here. Even if it was a natural virus, was it used for something? Okay. So we can't get away from this topic. It was so, it has escalated so much, so we really have to mention it. And so the first idea, this is a personal idea, personal thought, was the virus appeared all over different parts of the globe.
Yeah.
So we always refer to China because China identified a number of people with a different disease. They identified the virus, they made the tests, they shared with others. But and if you look, the difference between timing is alarmingly close. Italy wasn't able to do this. France wasn't able to do this. The United States denied anything was happening, so clearly they weren't able to do this.
Yeah.
So if the spread was that quick, that this capacity of identification could have happened anywhere. So why weren't scientists all over the world finding the same thing at the same time, and why were we stopped looking at China? You see?
That's a good question.
Because in Italy, it was clear it was happening at the same time. 1 week, 2 weeks, 1 month. But everything from scientific investigation point of view, nothing came from it. Nothing. And it wouldn't come nothing from Portugal. It didn't come nothing from Spain, from France, nothing from the UK, nothing from the United States. And this makes me think, really, in this geopolitics, what if it did appear in China? Okay, they have this extra time of advance. But what if it didn't appear in China? You know, we were just lucky it got there, because if it hadn't got there, this would have walked to a totally different pace. And this is even more scary to me than thinking China made up the virus.
Yeah, I mean, it is. Sorry.
No, tell me.
Yeah, and again, the governments are caught in a situation right now where there's panic and there's concern. And when we feel under pressure, we are less efficient in making decisions. We're more prone to making misjudgments because we feel pressured. And perhaps in the fullness of time, we would get the true story. So, for example, we call the flu from the First World War the Spanish flu, but we know it wasn't it didn't, originate in Spain. But we know that because of the passage of time, when we had the ability we had the space to sit back, don't feel any pressure, and let's look at the data and let's truly understand what has happened. So I think right now, as you pointed out, the US is going into an election right now, and different governments have different concerns. And to be fair, medical practitioners aren't unlike economists, right? You ask 2-3 economists, what do they think is going on with the economy? You get 2-3 different answers because they have different points of view. And similarly, we've seen medical practitioners in different countries or even within the same country have different perspectives. So I think it's unfortunate that it's become so politicized. And of course, when there's a distrust of government, there will be conspiracy theories. But hopefully, when some time passes and we've had the ability to relax and reflect on the data, and the data could be cleansed and perhaps made a little bit more accurate, we would scientifically better understand the pattern of what has happened. But you're right. Right now, we're just in confusion. And when people are confused, we say things and we make up things and we try to figure it out because we don't know. We're scared. So we don't know. So, yeah.
So another very interesting thought that I picked up from reading a little bit of your book was the idea that this virus spread very quickly because we are in an interconnected world. It has never been so interconnected. Yet with the Spanish flu, it was so interconnected, and it reached the whole world.
Yep, that's right.
So, to what extent can we really blame our interconnectivity, and only that interconnectivity? We could blame migration because there's always going to be migration. People always have the need to change. But apparently 100 years ago, it reached just the same areas of the globe without this connectivity. And I think this needs a thought if we want to blame globalization for the quick spread of the disease.
You're right. And perhaps the only difference would perhaps be the speed of transmission. Because back 100 years ago, you'd be waiting for a ship to cross the Atlantic from Lisbon to, let's say, New York, right? And that ship will probably take some weeks. Whereas now it'll be a plane, and the plane takes hours. So the speed of transmission, but you're right, globalization, we throw that term around, but hasn't the world always been globalized? So, and the Spanish flu, yes, but even when you go further back, there was this so-called Black Death, and the mortality rates were incredibly high, but it transmitted over a wide geographical spread as well. So I think the trend that I'm seeing coming out of that, again, it's not creating a new trend, but accelerating a pre-existing trend would be mm, a kind of nationalistic, xenophobic, or let's say a greater desire to defend borders. Because, I was talking to another person I was interviewing on a podcast, and he's American. And like many Americans, well, like most Americans, your ancestors came from somewhere else. And he was able to trace through his family when his family, members of his family came over on a boat from Italy to New York. And back in those days, you can land at Ellis Island, so this island off of New York, and you go through some quick health check, make sure there's nothing obvious, and welcome to America. There's no passport. There's no need for an identity document. If you had one, that'd be nice, but you don't really need one. And then fast forward some decades, then you needed a passport. And then fast forward some decades, that passport needed a visa. Fast forward to where we are right now, even if you have a visa, you're not getting into certain countries. And, now you need some sort of health check. First of all, you need to be in a travel corridor, a travel bubble. And then that changes as well. So, for example, between here and the UK, that was funny because I was trying to come here from the UK. And at one moment, no quarantine, you can come from the UK, and then yes, quarantine. And then it went back again. So it's a moving target. But the point is, it's becoming increasingly difficult for human beings to move from one jurisdiction to another. And I don't. Sorry?
It's the ultimate power. I can stop people.
Yeah.
I decide this is power. I can exercise power like this.
Mm-hmm.
But we have also to look at the world and think about plans that exactly try to make that change.
Mm-hmm.
We think about the European Union of the single market, not the European Union. The single market has that, but we also have to look at the African Union, for example, and how Africa tries to, before it even really starts to make the rules, are planning to not have those rules and make have a different perception of what is a country, what is a continent, where we should be united since the beginning, without starting imposing these rules. So I think that in the world, many different solutions are going to come up for that, but global solutions, global order for that, probably it's not very far.
Yeah. And going back to Europe, what was interesting to observe is that even against, I guess, the convention that brought Europe together, certain countries did close their borders. In contrast,
that's a geographical misevaluation, because countries closed borders within themselves, which is even more severe.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, you're right. Yeah.
It's not. I think it's not so severe for us to have closed the border with Spain.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's much more severe. We closed inside our country borders to certain regions, and those people couldn't get in or out.
Yeah, that is a good point. So, stepping back, do you think the European experiment has been damaged or strengthened as a result of what we've gone through so far?
I actually think it has strengthened.
Okay.
Because one of the things that Brexit supposedly would bring us was this idea that bring us other Europeans. Was this idea that, see, they're more sovereign. They have their frontiers. They have their landmarks. They control them. And this was a reminder that, listen, we have our borders too, and we can close them whenever we want. We just don't need them, and we don't want to.
Okay.
And those borders are there. We are different. So we don't need to be less united to ensure us that we are different.
Okay.
That's why I say it's so more damaging, so more shocking to have frontiers closed inside your own country.
Mm-hmm.
Cities isolated. I think that's more shocking.
Yeah, and to a large extent, for many nations, it may have been either the first time it's happened or it's been quite a long time since such powers have been exercised. And then that leads, at least to me, it's a segue, and forgive me if you're going to touch on it later on. It's the power of elected officials. In the months that have passed in 2020, they have accrued to themselves more power. And the question is, well, constitutionally, depending on the country, is that a dangerous precedent? Because what we have found historically is once people get power, they're reluctant to give it up.
I think you can, if you make a small panel,
Mm-hmm.
you can write down the name of countries that have done that,
Mm-hmm.
and you can make a checklist, and you can ask yourself, this country did this, was it a temporary measure?
Mm-hmm.
Who decided
Mm-hmm.
if he could or could not get those powers?
Mm-hmm.
Because if decision was from the same individual,
Mm-hmm.
he already had those powers, let's face
it. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. If it was a parliament, an elected parliament, and it was temporary, like 15 days, then we're okay with it. Probably it was okay within the constitution.
Mm-hmm.
Does that country have a written constitution to which go to? It also depends on the judicial system, how the laws work in that country. Because if you have a written document, you have always a defense that it won't happen. If you have an interpretation of historical legislation, and if there are precedents, you may have opened a precedent for the next situation.
Yes. Yeah.
So it's a very good analysis. Probably more interesting at the national than international level, but comparison may see the different way the different models work and make people think a little bit in which model I feel safer within my rights.
Okay. Okay.
I had this one coming in my thought, which is, what if we had space colonies?
Okay. What if?
This is a little bit outside, but how would coronavirus, would it get to the space colonies? I was thinking about this because the control in transportation, in air trafficking, because one of the things that people ask themselves is, we're going to be more controlled, just like in Alice Island, like you were saying, we would have health checks for traveling. But what about space colonies?
Okay, that's interesting.
Because if we're thinking in a future post-pandemic, space colonies are something that is being planned for our future.
Yeah, and we know in the US, there's Elon Musk, SpaceX, and Richard Branson in the UK, Virgin Galactic, who are creating private enterprises which are based on that idea. So you're right. It is something not far away.
And getting a little bit back, I lost an idea there, which was we were talking about how long it took to travel in the beginning of the 20th century, in the beginning of the 21st century. But time was not on our side on coronavirus, because things started apparently in November, December, and we only have reports of China, not anywhere else in the world. And things started being discovered in January, February. So it's 3 months.
Yeah.
So still, it's much longer than that boat trip.
Indeed. But as you going back to the point about space travel, at least again, from what we are seeing in the English-speaking world, because that's what I could pay attention to. There's been a sort of, it's too early to call it a trend, but there's definitely been a bit of de-urbanization where people have left major cities. So it's a big deal going on right now in LA, Los Angeles, and San Francisco, New York, Chicago, to some extent London as well, the center of London. And people are looking at, well, wealthy people, that sort of mobility, there's greater propensity to move if you're wealthy because you would have already had a second home in the countryside. So you go to your country home. And for those who could even afford more, they're looking at other countries. And New Zealand, because we speak, and I've interviewed a couple of people who in the investment migration business, and they've seen an interest in New Zealand precisely because of how far away it is. And even if you're in quarantine, it's, you have a large home with many acres around you. So, you can still go out and with your family, and you basically, you're relatively remote and safe. So if we were to extend that and we were to, let's say 50 years or however long it takes for commercial space travel to be economically viable, then it's not so far-fetched to say that wealthy people, those who can afford it, would, in the case of a pandemic, jump on a space, whatever, and they would go to whatever the colony is. I mean, it is the natural next step. It makes sense. Yeah.
In our post-pandemic worldview, we have to.
So I think, for SpaceX and for Virgin Galactic, well, more SpaceX because I think Richard Branson is in economic difficulty right now, whereas Elon Musk, he's seen his net worth actually increase. So I think for something like for SpaceX, it may even bring forward the timeline. So if they were worried about investments in the past or the viability of the model, I think the business case for that model just got strengthened. Given what we're going through right now, people would like remote locations, and the further away, the more attractive it may be.
But don't forget, those in the remote locations may not want them there.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
But we'll get there on another point.
Yeah.
To finish biological warfare, the big question would be, what changes do we want to maintain to prevent this in the future? And also knowing that I cannot control this, because the thing is, let's consider that China made all this up and they released the virus. They were not able to control it at all. So I think that even if we do believe this was made up with a purpose, clearly that purpose lost all control. There was no control of it. It could be not in national interest, because right now, probably mostly because of the southern south, not because of anything personal, but because of the resources they can do to in health matters. It's going to be, all countries there are going to be reservoirs. So it's very difficult that if this was really like an ammunition, I think countries will rethink, do I want to use it? Do I want to invest in this? Because the chances of getting out of control and me shooting myself, I think this type of pandemics show it's very high.
I guess, as again, assuming the theory that it is potentially an intentional act of aggression, it's not without precedent, because human beings have been using diseases for a while. I mean, for example, I think in the 1700s and 1800s, when the European colonists moved to the United States and they wanted to take the land from the native people that were there, they gave them blankets that were infected with chickenpox, knowing that they had no resistance to it. And that was an intentional act. We know that things like that have happened in the past and they will happen in the future. It's just a part of life. But I would imagine, sorry?
But considering it is smallpox, they only speed it up because it was going to happen anyway.
True. With the flow of people across the Atlantic, it was inevitable. So they accelerated what was inevitable.
Of course, making it on purpose, it's totally out of sense or mind. But smallpox is something that you have never been able to control.
Yeah.
And historically, probably, don't forget, we're thinking about the North of America, but we have to look at the South. And there are no reports of that, and smallpox was a very big issue.
Yeah. So, again, we don't know. And perhaps in time, when this panic has passed and people are able to look at it with more objective eyes and analyze data, maybe they would see intent or maybe not. And if they find intent, it wouldn't be the first time and it won't be the last. So.
But control of that intent, we're for sure we don't have.
Right, and that kind of ties into the previous point about the increasing desire of countries to control their own borders. That was one of the major drivers behind Brexit. They just wanted control of their borders. And I think it's not going to go away. Countries will want to control them. And as you pointed out, even movement within the country, leaders would want the ability to control that as well. So
historically, they've always wanted.
Yeah.
So
they got what they want.
Repeating itself. So
yeah.
It's not strange. The strange is, why haven't we been able to repress those desires? And why did people vote to reinforce those desires? So geography, the next point. So I already spoken of the southern world has a reservoir only because we associate the southern world with less ability most countries to have good health support for their populations.
Yeah.
Okay. Because in the North countries, of course, any country without any good health support, probably it's not going. I don't think eradication is even being discussed right now. Only in New Zealand, because everywhere else in the world, everyone is speaking more eradication. I think that even in Portugal right now, we're going to the Sweden model. Period. We're going to assume it, not because it was the best model to begin with, but because we've decided which rules to implement. We have some experience for months, so now we've decided these rules we're going to implement to reduce risks. It's going to be and also geography. If we are discussing a pandemic world, we have to decide to choose which world are we discussing. And do I want to have a global analysis? I want to have continent.
Microphone.
Do I want to have an analysis within each continent? Do you want to make country analysis? Because evolution, change, it's going to be very, very different from country to country.
Absolutely, yeah.
It can be radical in some countries. It can be incremental in other countries. Of course, this has all to do with it comes from behind. But I think we'll think much more about this when we talk about environment and digitalization. But would you like to add anything up in geography?
Not really, except to me, when we spoke last Friday, that was the biggest takeaway for me. The idea that, well, I shouldn't view it with an a lens that was focused on the Anglo-Saxon world only, that I should take a wider perspective and to recognize that different countries are having very different experiences with what's happening right now. So we need to be open-minded. That was my takeaway. So yeah.
Okay. So environment.
Mm-hmm.
I don't believe in any change in environment will be made because of the pandemic.
Okay.
I don't think that just because we're receiving information that all over the world nature is regaining some kind of control, people are going to change consumption based on that.
Mm-hmm.
Or politicians, since we're always been subject of individual and corporative interests,
Yeah.
politicians might take some grab the opportunity to insist on this.
Mm-hmm.
Because I think, yeah, having dolphins
Mm-hmm.
in Lisbon,
Yeah.
more than usual, much more than usual, that we haven't seen this number of dolphins every day for decades, and suddenly they're always visiting us. It's a very something that it can sell easily, of course.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't think it will be enough to suddenly say, see, we're going to stop traffic of boats in the river, or no more recreative navigation in the river.
Mm-hmm.
I doubt that. Or people are, oh yeah, I'm going to sell my boat. I'm not going to use it anymore because there's dolphins there. I have some difficulty thinking that the environment, just because it was able to show us we're still here, is going to be able to make a change in consumption pattern.
Mm-hmm. I would agree with that. And if there is any positive impact on the environment, it will be consequential. It would be unintended. So the intent, I don't believe any government, any multinational company, their intent will be to help the environment. They would just be responding to factors elsewhere, and it may have a positive impact on the environment. May. And I'm thinking specifically going back to the border issue, border control. It won't just be the movement of people, but it'll be the movement of goods. So we know that certain European countries have created incentives for their companies to depend less on China. So to bring some manufacturing, bring jobs back home. Same with the US, same with Japan. It's not going to, I'm not saying that all manufacturing will come back near shore, but I think there will be some movement. And therefore, the whole supply chain that we've grown accustomed to will continue to reform. And again, this is not something that's new. It's something to some extent that started happening pre-pandemic because there were trade wars and so on and so forth, but it may accelerate that trend. And if you're bringing it near shore, obviously manufacturing standards for environmental control are higher in Europe. They're higher in North America than there are in certain parts of Asia. So therefore, the same products that we enjoy may be manufactured to high environmental standards, which will benefit the environment. But the whole move was not done in an effort to save the dolphins. So if there are a few more dolphins that don't get killed, okay, so be it. That's by the way. There were wider geopolitical motives behind doing that. So yeah.
But I would add, one more reason for that change in supply chains, which we saw in Portugal. The need for change was not only, and the quick change was not at all because of the need to replace China and create more jobs here. It was the need to maintain jobs here. And we saw this. It was very in Portugal, it was very clear. It was even spoken out in television. It was publicized. We have a very strong textile industry. There were no masks. So if you see in Portugal, we are very keen in using textile masks.
Yeah.
Instead of disposable ones,
Mm-hmm.
and almost all of them, which doesn't mean that the fabric itself is made in Portugal,
Mm-hmm.
okay? Because probably the fabric is made in China,
Right.
but
Mm-hmm.
which means that this change
Mm-hmm.
was trying to give an answer that did not exist in Portugal. And the fact is, I have the idea it's a very national thing, because I'm not sure we see it in any other country, at least in what we see in reports from other countries. People wearing textile masks,
Mm-hmm.
and to an extent that we're doing them in with universities, so they can filter, they can be antimicrobian. You have masks that kill the virus themselves,
Mm-hmm.
and they're all textile, which
Yeah.
is something amazing.
Mm-hmm.
So our masks in textile can be safer than the surgical ones that were made to use to fly. So it's something just crazy.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Mm-hmm.
but I don't think so this other option,
Mm-hmm.
which is we need to adapt because we need a quick answer now,
Mm-hmm.
more than the replacement of the supply chain. I don't think that was the question at all.
Mm-hmm.
Also needs to be spoken, because personally,
Mm-hmm.
personal opinion on this,
Mm-hmm.
I don't think that changing a factory from China to anywhere else in the world will give a big boost in employment. Because nowadays,
Yeah.
if you change a factory, you
Mm-hmm.
made it more, uh, or or better, you make it less dependent
On people.
on workers.
Agreed. Agreed. Yeah.
Probably what you will see is cheaper factories than in China,
Mm-hmm.
because the next step is we don't need workers.
Mm-hmm. Mm.
So I'm not seeing them. Okay, we've had a 20-year-old factory there. 20 years ago, we needed 1,000 workers. I'm not going to take 1,000 employees. I'm not going to need that if I move the factory somewhere else.
Yeah, I agree. And perhaps back when we started that push towards global supply chains, it was driven by the fact that, to a large extent, uh, manufacturing was very human intensive. Now it's become very capital intensive in terms of mechanization. And yeah, so there's now a business case, and now it could be to the economic benefit of the company to bring it back on shore, because you would have that higher skilled labor, the programmers or whoever it would be to operate those machines. So yeah, I agree with.
Factories are not going to change to be more expensive.
Yeah, because that's how the businesses don't operate that way. They have a built-in incentive to always find a cheaper option, and especially if we're operating in an environment where, in some countries, there's a slowdown in the economy. People have less disposable income, so now is not the time to be looking to raise your prices or to raise your cost of production. Makes no sense. You should be looking to do the opposite, which is to rationalize your cost. So, yeah.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
I'll suggest that we wrap up environment.
Mm-hmm.
And the next point I have here is digitalization.
Yes. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Digitalization.
Mm-hmm.
I think this is the point where people agree most that it's not a new trend. This is not going to be radical. This is
Yes.
incremental.
Yeah.
So
Mm-hmm.
digitalization, it's nothing new.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so it was good that we could offer something immediately because it was already made. That
Mm-hmm.
it was so quick.
Mm-hmm.
But still, I'm a little bit amazed,
Mm-hmm.
not by how fast it grew,
Mm-hmm.
but the opposite,
Mm-hmm.
how slow it was.
Mm-hmm.
You know, he talked about something some minutes ago, which was every country was revising their numbers, so numbers were changing.
Mm-hmm.
So I have to question myself,
Mm-hmm.
but were they writing the numbers in paper?
Mm-hmm.
You know,
Yeah.
were their registers in paper? Because if their registers were made in a digital system, like, you know, yeah, that person has COVID, I write COVID. So you can count immediately how many people infected with COVID. That's how health system information systems are working right now. So if
Yeah.
someone dies, you know immediately that person died and she had this diagnosis. So, so I have to question myself, how are they revising numbers? How is that possible?
Mm-hmm.
In a country that, in a world
Mm-hmm.
where you have digital records, you have digital data. So why is this happening?
Mm-hmm.
It can be by several things. We can have all records are digital, but we have secure laws that prevent information from being shared.
Mm-hmm.
This can happen.
Mm-hmm.
But then I wouldn't be able to revise the numbers anyway.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the numbers would be the same.
Mm-hmm.
It could be that because we didn't know what to consider infection or not infection, we weren't collecting all the information in the beginning. We started collecting more and more information
Mm-hmm.
with the last cases that we were collecting in the beginning. So this can be it too. But I'm still amazed at it.
Well, I'm not sure about elsewhere, but I think when I was looking at the story in Italy and in the US, it was about the methodology used to determine cause of death. And there was this whole debate about dying with the virus or dying from the virus. So we had, I mean, it's not, I mean, it sounds weird, but there have been documented cases where someone was riding a bike and they got hit by a car, but they tested positive for the virus. Did they die from being hit by a car, or did they die from the virus? And there have been medical practitioners, if they were to strictly in the US, to strictly follow the CDC guidelines.
Mm-hmm.
Once you were positive, you had to put the cause of death as the virus,
Mm-hmm.
even though logically you know that perhaps the impact of the car was really the cause of death, but you were positive, right? So I think the debate or the discussion right now has shifted to an agreement where there's some agreement that the methodology needs to shift from dying with the virus to dying from it. So if you were, the victim of a gunshot wound or you're hit by a car or whatever, obviously that trauma was the real cause of death potentially. And so you don't check the box for the virus. In addition to which, there were financial incentives in the US where the federal government basically told local hospitals, if the cause of death is the virus, if you put it, you will get a rebate of 20 something thousand dollars. Whereas if you put the cause of death is not the virus, you're going to get $9,000. So,
which goes to the question of the private hospitals having to secure their own income to maintain functioning because they weren't doing anything else.
exactly. I spoke to so many medical practitioners just within my network who they were bracing and they were preparing for this huge influx of virus cases, and it just didn't happen. So all the other practitioners, like orthopedic surgeons or whatever other disciplines they were specialized in, they had nothing to do because all non-essential surgeries were being postponed. All other forms of treatment were being postponed in the expectation that this influx would happen, which in some cases it did not. So, but anyway, we learned, we lived, we're figuring it out.
In Portugal, we have an interesting thing, which is since 2012, I think, we have something that we call a digital death certificate. I'm sure it's not nothing new. Most countries in the Western world have this, but it's interesting that we have a website where we can see by the minute, by the group of 10 minutes, how much people die every day in Portugal.
Wow. Yeah.
Because the system itself, so it's collecting the data,
Mm-hmm.
and the government decided, let's share this data.
Mhm.
So you know the number of people that are dying in hospitals, that died at home the previous day, that day. You can see it by the day. And it's funny because everyone immediately could see the curves. They could see if we were dying more or not according to the virus.
Mhm.
And it's very interesting that we had that information on the minute.
Mhm.
You know, I think it gave us some kind of trust that our data is reliable data.
Mhm.
And we don't have that profit question.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah,
We are public services mostly.
exactly.
So we don't have that incentive.
Mhm.
So, and we're trying to find out why so much more people died,
Mhm.
because not everyone died with COVID.
Mhm.
So our question is not everyone who died was registered as COVID. Our question is the opposite.
Yeah, yeah.
Much more people died,
Mhm.
and people that from a certain point onward, everyone who was in a hospital was being tested, period.
Mhm. Mhm.
But even so, much more people were dying than usual for this time of the year. And we haven't found a real explanation for this. Was it that people, we have many hypotheses for this.
Yeah.
Were people running away from services because they were scared?
Mhm.
Because services, the emergency services were providing the same services.
Mhm.
So, of course, like in the States, some services were being closed to ensure that we had ability, capacity for other things.
Mhm.
But was it because the services were closed that more people were attending emergency room? No, because the number of people going to emergency room was decreasing.
Wow.
And there were no more severe cases arriving at the emergency room. The proportion was the same.
Mhm.
So the fact that we have this digitalization of death
Mhm.
and of sickness
Mhm.
allows us to have different thoughts. So we're not worried about recounting the cases.
Mhm.
We're worried about what happened to those people who died.
Yeah.
You know?
I think that's a key point you're making, that when people speculate when in the absence of information, and if you have the data to hand, then you have something tangible in front of you to investigate. Whereas in at least in the US, there was there was confusion over numbers. There was general confusion over numbers. And then even the media itself, the media shifted the debate, because I remember at one point, every day you'd wake up to the number of deaths. And then as the number of deaths began to fall, they were just talking about the number of infections. So to a large extent, the media, which I understand, they're private companies, they need to get paid, they need to attract attention, so they get advertising dollars. But they were not necessarily helpful in understanding what was happening. They were just chasing what they believed to be an exciting story. So, yeah.
We have a daily public report from the government with every number of us, so we can just go read it. We don't need to see the media
Mm-hmm.
and stuff. So, but I was expecting digitalization to be at a level
Mm-hmm.
where everyone had this,
Mm-hmm.
and it was disappointing to understand that no, we're not at that point.
Mm-hmm. And then,
We're still not there.
so coming out of that now, I think there would be a greater appetite to embrace technology, because especially people who were more entrenched in the old way of doing things, they would probably be dislodged or more open because of what's happening. So, for example, like my clients, they tend to insist, "Oh, I need to meet you in person. I need to meet you in person." Now, everyone is comfortable with a Zoom meeting. People who were afraid of video conferencing, it's now the new norm. A video conference, we don't need to meet in person. So that's one application of technology. And then, of course, with education, more controversially, of course, online learning So just various parts of our lives, there's perhaps greater embracing of technology. Shopping, for either groceries or for clothing or whatever. Fewer people going to physical retail outlets, happy to just stay on their phone and purchase whatever they need to. So, and then this is business, B2C, business to consumers, but also B2B, like meeting with suppliers or with, people that you just do business with, manufacturing service providers. So in short, I think the technology was always there, but the rate of adoption may have been relatively low. But surely I would think that there has been an acceleration in terms of the integration of technology in everyday life as people, as consumers, as well as everyday business practice. And we see that when we look at the stock market performance of firms that are heavily reliant on technology, they seem to have done better than those that were less technology driven. So,
as for education, I have to disagree completely.
I know, yeah. Mm-hmm.
For one simple reason. It's not that people
Mm-hmm.
do not like the idea or the concept.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But if you have 3 kids, the cost of having to have internet connection, 3 computers, one for each of them, and you have to work, and at the same time taking an eye on them, this is totally unthinkable. It's an increase in costings, and several children did not have access to schooling, period, because online schooling was not an option. Don't forget that digitalization is very centered on smartphones.
Yeah.
So Zoom has a giant boom, yes. Did computers have a giant boom for people to use Zoom? Not really. For informal purposes, Zoom is being used with smartphones. Even smartphones, because of the way they work, the cameras, the way they produce the microphones, they work much better than a computer for communicating. So you're only going to use a computer if you want to do some more work. So these costs of having to have the internet access, which has to be right now by ground line, to give some kind of speed and quality to the work. You have to have the computers for each child. This is very expensive.
It is. Which is why I see in some places there's a debate now as to whether Wi-Fi or broadband connection is now a human right, like utility, like running water and electricity. So for example, let's say 1, 2, 3 generations ago, we saw the rollout of electricity. So not every household had, if you had money, if you were wealthy, you can afford you could have afforded kerosene lamps, you can put oil, you can afford the oil was not cheap. So you had lights, and then when electricity came out, you were probably, if you were wealthy, you could afford to have the wiring done into your home. And then think about that. So all the kids went to school during the day, but the wealthy kids, when they got home at night, they got to do homework. They got to study more. So it created presumably some sort of divide where they had an advantage driven by technology. Eventually, it was equalized to some extent, I know debatable, as electricity and running water was considered to be essential and not a luxury. At first it was a luxury, now it's essential. I would propose that at least in some cities or countries that could afford it, because not all countries can afford it, that debate will continue to happen. And it's not just education, but now medical diagnosis is done over the internet. You have, doctors would log in and do this, whatever, and then they can diagnose. It's becoming more of a civil liberty or human right, because to be deprived of broadband, there are no more newspapers, so you're deprived of information as to what's happening. You're deprived of education, and you may even be deprived of healthcare. So you are unable to participate in your country by not having broadband, depending on where you are.
But don't forget that by having a kid and not having electricity at your home,
Mhm.
you can be accused of not treating your kid right.
Mm.
The same thing with internet.
Yeah.
There will come a point for that thought to function
Mhm.
that you will have to impose that families have
Mhm.
to use online services.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And when
Mhm.
probably that will be the turning point.
Mhm.
When that decision comes, because the political decision won't be made
Mhm.
because it's good for everyone.
Mhm.
It's going to be made because we want to enforce it.
Yeah.
So there's some kind of interest.
Mhm.
Okay.
Mhm.
So for electricity and education, I think that enforcing someone to study, it's acceptable.
Mhm.
But forcing someone to change from live study to education to online education,
Mhm.
that can raise some questions,
Mhm.
because do we need it? Is it better?
Mhm.
Is it really that much better? But also, it won't solve the production problem,
What
because
production problem?
you still need someone taking care of the children at home.
Right. Yeah. Which, interestingly enough, so a Supreme Court judge passed away recently in the U.S. And so, at least in the U.S. media, there's been a lot of documentaries and people commenting on her legacy. And she was one of the first civil rights lawyers back in the 1960s and 70s, 60s, to argue in favor of allowing women to work. Before she came, it was perfectly acceptable that both the laws of the United States as well as the hiring practices of companies discriminated against women. And when she argued the case in the Supreme Court, the rebuttal against her argument was, who's going to take care of the children? If women go to work and get an equal wage, who, the family life will fall apart. Kids will go crazy. But I think we kind of figured it out. I mean, to some extent, they were right, maybe. They argued that divorce rates will go up and men's self esteem will go down or whatever. But I think to some extent, we figured it out in terms of the kids. And I have to believe that to some extent, we'll need to figure it out. As to what the solution is, I don't propose to know. But especially right now, there are people who are excluded from the education process because they live in a rural community, because they're poor and they can't afford to take the bus to work, or they can't afford, whatever. And if by making broadband cheap and easily accessible to everyone, it gives these people who are now excluded a chance to get basic education or to get advanced education, things that their family could not afford. Yes, I agree with you. It'll be a downside. We are serious. I mean, there are productivity issues, and some academics are trying to measure it right now. But I believe that we would need to figure it out because the upside will potentially beat the downside.
I know the solutions many parents are taking, which is, first of all, I don't think that the question man, woman is a question here.
Yeah.
Because people that were able to work from home, many of them were the men, not the women. So they had to stay with the kids.
Yeah.
Okay. But it's interesting to think at that time,
Mm-hmm.
who stayed with the children? And the question is schools.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So this is the question. Schools evolved. They were very important at that time for that situation. We don't want to go back.
Mhm.
but still someone needs to take care of the children.
Yeah. Mhm.
And I'm not stating it's the woman.
Mhm.
The thing is,
Mhm.
the person who does take care of the children, will it get an employment?
Mhm.
Will it work at home during the day? I have to try to work a little bit,
Mhm.
stay with the children, see if they are studying, take them to bed, and then work after that.
Yep. Yeah.
That's what couples are doing now.
Mhm. Mhm.
You know, work had to get in their 24 hours routine so
Mhm.
they could do that extra part of the school.
Correct.
And online schooling, even if you have all the digital tools, has to deal with this.
Mhm. Yeah.
Um,
And again, it also speaks to the income divide because disproportionately, the jobs that are able to work from home, they tend to be the higher paying jobs. If you are a lower paying, you're a sweeper, you're a cleaner, you can't work from home. The low income jobs tend to require you to be present, physically present. So it becomes a greater issue for low income families, who I need to go to my job, which is to clean the streets or whatever. Who's going to look after the kids at home? So I see again, when even not just this, but some of the previous factors that we explored, again, unfortunately, did disproportionately impact on lower income families. So, but anyway. Mhm.
um, now that you spoke of low income, another thing that we heard to speak, digitalization,
Mhm.
was money.
Mm.
We heard spoken a lot of money and how money could transmit the virus.
Yeah.
So suddenly money was part of a non-hygienical process that we had to abolish.
Yes. Yeah.
You know, notes being disinfected in central banks,
Yeah.
they were being closed for 1 week, all kind of new process for making money a cleaner
Mm-hmm.
uh, material. And so we picked up,
Mm-hmm.
and although with higher costs, services, companies were starting to say people pay digital, pay digital. And by digital, I mean not only smartphones, but also wireless payments, wireless? No, not wireless,
Yeah.
touchless,
Yeah. 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 Contact.
touchless cards,
Yeah.
and all that.
Mm-hmm.
And personally, I have chosen to leave my wallet at home
Yeah.
for a year and something now.
Wow.
With some personal cost because things don't always work, but chips in cards don't always work.
Sure.
That's the story we all know.
Yeah.
So we've all been repeat placing the card for some time until it works.
Yeah.
So nothing's perfect.
Mm-hmm.
But I find it funny
Mm-hmm.
how this trend, which it's always one of those trends that it's presented as it's going to stay because of the pandemic, people are going to use it and they're going to like it, is also very socially excluding.
Mm. Yeah, I agree with you. Yeah.
You can't make
Mm.
a smartphone payment without a smartphone.
Mm-hmm.
To have a card, I know that credits function very differently from country to country.
Mm-hmm.
So just to state this, because I'm thinking that more people from Anglo-Saxon cultures are going to hear us,
Mm-hmm.
we don't have easy access to credit in Europe. We don't have credit scores.
Right.
So it works in a totally different way. So you have to prove
Mm-hmm.
first that you can actually pay
Yeah.
so that you have access to credit. So it works in a totally different way. So that's why we're such a big fans also of debit cards, because credit cards are hard to have access to.
Mm-hmm.
But you know that the longest living project of contactless payment or payment by phone is an African project, right?
Okay.
You've heard about M-Pesa.
No, I haven't. What is that?
M-Pesa, it's a very interesting African project. It's
Mhm.
it has 30 million clients.
Mhm.
It works in 10 countries in Africa. So if anyone listening to us is interested in mobile payments, go check M-Pesa
Okay.
because it works on regular phones.
Mm.
You know, it works by SMS.
Mm.
So in places where people live so distant from each other,
Mhm.
they don't have internet, they don't have access to ATM machines,
Mhm.
so they don't have access to banks. Your family can just send you an SMS.
Mhm.
You have in your account money.
Mhm.
Okay, you want to pay something in the shop, you send an SMS. So there's no need for the physical transportation, where transportation is very hard to do.
Yeah.
And what do you see in the Western world? Payments by internet.
Yeah. Mm.
You know, you have to have that smartphone, you have to have that QR code reader or that NFC
Yeah.
smartphone.
Mhm.
And SMS, which is used for mobile payments in a network of 10 countries, 30 million clients,
Mhm.
doesn't have space in Western world. So I think that if we want, because digitalization doesn't need to be complicated.
Mhm. Mhm.
You know, it needs to be easy. It needs to be usable. And clearly, the Western world does not. The companies that right now are making big decisions for what access you have to digital, clearly are not interested in simple solutions, easy to use and
Mhm.
accessible to everyone, without having to pay for high-end equipment, for internet connections and all that.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely a profit incentive, and there's an incentive for wealthier companies to make sure that competitors that provide a cheaper, easier solution, they don't exactly see the light of day. So,
Imagine. We could have a cashless world
yeah.
based on SMS. And this happens in Africa. Can you imagine this? A cashless society based on SMS.
Yeah. But if I were $1 trillion company like Apple, that probably would not be good news for me, because I need
But
people
this
to
is,
buy high-end handsets and to use Apple Pay and to use my stuff. So yeah, I can understand where there's a conflict of interest there.
but we need to think this if you want a real post-pandemic world. You know, why do simpler options exist? Why do they work so efficiently in other countries? And why are we being subject of these situations? For example,
Mhm.
I have a situation in Portugal which is very interesting, which is
Mhm.
some companies opted to
Mhm.
use technology that simply doesn't work in Apple phones,
Okay,
because Apple is the most protectionist company.
absolutely.
So we have products that are made only for Android systems.
Okay.
And it's very interesting. For example, in Oporto, you can travel in public transportation. You pay with your smartphone with an NFC and Bluetooth.
Mhm.
So you don't, and that doesn't work with Apple because Apple does not give access to their NFC to other companies. In Lisbon,
Mhm.
they forget it doesn't work. You can't have that system on smartphones. We can't just go with our smartphone in transportation because Apple, because people
Mhm.
iOS. But we have a Portuguese company that made a decision different from Visa. Visa
Mhm.
decided we're not going to have our own way of contactless payment
Mhm.
apps. They decided we're going to give it to Google, we're going to give it to Samsung, we're going to give to other companies
Mhm.
to create those products
Mhm.
and use our payment network.
Right. Yeah.
But in Portugal, we have our own national, private but national
Mhm.
payment company, and
Mhm.
they decided to do the opposite.
Mhm.
No, we're going to do our own app. You're going to play with your smartphone, but we're going to make the software.
Yeah.
And because we're present all over the country, we're basically the only player, because we have so many types of different payment methods that don't have international usage, but they're very practical. We're going to make our own app, and people are going to start to pay in every terminal. You can pay anywhere in the country with your app, so it's a national thing. And they just made a different app for Apple and for Android, So yeah, I think we can start seeing a trend in which these companies have to start making decisions for the consumer.
I agree with you, and I think again that
want this to evolve and reach more people. We can't evolve on what they decide.
I agree with you, and I think that's a trend that perhaps started before the pandemic, but will be accelerated by it. Whereas, they were basically monopolies or oligopolies. And as has always happened, so for example, at least in the US, you had like 3 or 4 big television networks, ABC, CBS, NBC. And they dominated for a while, and then they were challenged and broken up and whatever. So now there are hundreds of channels. And similarly, once upon a time, there was just Uber. Now it's been challenged, it's been broken up, and now there are regional champions appearing. Uber is more or less retreating from the global position that it once held to the English-speaking world, basically. So mainly UK, North America. The rest, it's kind of like giving up slowly but surely. It's realizing. And I think especially in the US, there's a history of breaking up monopolies. They're allowed to run for a while. So I'm thinking of Standard Oil, the big railroad companies. At first, they're allowed to play, and then the government breaks them up. And I think the discussion was happening before the pandemic, and it will be brought back to the table. Facebook, Apple, Alphabet, which is Google, they're all going to be eventually broken up because history tells us that they would. They'll be attacked from the political side, and then consumers themselves, they would break off and embrace and engage with the local solutions. And this ties back into the stronger borders. So, if there's relatively less international travel, at least for a while, or governments are a bit more protectionist than they were previously, that provides a great environment, a great ecosystem for local champions to evolve, as opposed to being worried about big guys coming over the border and kind of taking over. So I agree with you that you will see the rise of local payment solutions, local ride sharing, the age of the super apps, as the Chinese call theirs. I think they are probably over. I think they've seen the height of their game, and the super apps will give way to local solutions that, again, they're so tailored to the local ecosystem that they'll just be more convenient.
And I have to say that a lot of this results in what you spoke about, the rise of nationalism, but also about the recent way America has dealt with China. Because when it is stated that Chinese technology is an open door to a country being spied, it is also stating American technology is an open door for a country being spied.
Absolutely, yeah.
And I understand that people in America, many people might not understand this, but if we have no reason to doubt China, we have no reason to doubt the United States. And if they are stating that that country does that, it's because they know it's possible to do so.
And we know it's true because of this guy, Edward Snowden, who leaked all his classified documents. And we know that Angela Merkel, her phone was bugged, her Apple, so her iPhone. So it's not just possible. We know it's true. It's happening. It's happening. Yeah.
So I think that like it or dislike it, brought this to the table to consumers.
Yeah.
Buy local. Don't buy American. Don't buy Chinese. Buy from wherever you are because it's safer for you. This is the globalization, because you hear it on the news and you think, yeah, he's right. If I buy something from where I am in, I'm safer.
To me, it's people have been. I mean, there have been some vocal advocates of privacy, but for the most part, people have shown they really don't care. Facebook works because apparently billions of people in the world are quite happy to turn over all their personal information, including what they ate today, where they're going to go tomorrow, in exchange for access to a platform. So whereas a minority are against it, the majority are definitely for it. So I think that same selfish attitude is what will destroy the super apps, because I was moving around the UK last month and I realized that Uber, whereas before, it's been a while since I moved around the UK, and previously like a year or two before, Uber will kind of get me moving in most cities, whereas now I had to find local apps because there were relatively fewer Uber cars. Most of the cars were tied to a local network. And when I checked the local network, the maps were more accurate, the cars were nicer. So it's somehow they were able to tailor it so that it works best in that geography. So that's why people were going over, not out of any sense of local pride. It just worked better. It was built for that tiny town or that local city, as opposed to a big metropolis like London. So I think, that's what will drive the migration, just people being practical.
Also, those large numbers of people that started using this, not new, but start using more frequently these digital services, I think that for our post-pandemic world, there's a presumption that they prefer digital.
Yeah.
And the assumption is always this: digital came because once you go digital, you don't go back. And I'm not sure that is totally accurate, or in which areas that will be more accurate than others. I just have this idea that there is that assumption, but I don't know how to actually express this with some certainty. Finally, to finish up digitalization, an idea I picked up from what you wrote on your book. Remote work has freedom of movement.
Yeah.
I think we're very far away from that.
How so?
Very, very, very away from that. Because for that trend to pick up, we would first have to organize ourselves within our country to do so.
Okay.
So before we are able to think, I'm going to live in Spain. I know several people do this. Okay. But before we think, I need to go to Spain, I live there, and I take 2 hours plane and I have a meeting in Portugal, and then I go back to Spain because it's cheaper, I pay less taxes and all this. We would have to be able, culturally, to think that locally. So in case of Portugal, for those who know the example, I'm living in Alentejo. I have a big house with a garden with some acres. I'm happy here. And I have a beach close to me, or not. I have almost a desert close to me, depends on the area. But my work is at Lisbon, my office, at the capital city. So, and I'm not sure culturally we are able to introduce big journeys
Mm-hmm.
within our equally programmation. So once a week I have to go to the office. I have to do that big journey, those 2 hours,
Mm-hmm.
and then come back,
Mm-hmm.
or have to pay for a one night stay because I'm going 2 days. So all this needs to be worked out
Mm-hmm.
in local terms
Yeah.
before we can actually think it's an international trend.
Mm-hmm.
Because I'm not sure companies, and we see this now with the return to work, that companies are prepared to leave their workers for months without having meetings, because there has to be a hierarchy culture
Mm-hmm.
behind it, and I'm not sure it exists. Also, there
Mm-hmm.
needs to be a fiscal culture behind this.
Mm-hmm.
So I know that many people that do work at home in foreign countries, actually for tax purposes,
Mm-hmm.
they don't disclaim their address in that country.
Yeah. So
And there's no structure for this, for someone to be easily moving around and working in one country to another country.
Mm-hmm.
There's a long way for that.
So so this ties into the point we were discussing earlier, where remote work is skewed towards higher value services, right? So a programmer, a stock trader, or whatever. If you were a cleaner, a maid, a street sweeper, that's not an option. So it skews towards the wealthy. And I think you're right, it skews towards certain cultures as well. So I saw an article, I think it was last week in the New York Times, where they were talking about the remote work trend. So I get a sense in the Anglo-Saxon world, remote work is more accepted than in the continental Europe. I'm not sure. I saw a stat that said, I think last month, that 80% of workers in Paris had returned to the office, whereas in London it was 40%, 40. We know big companies like Apple and Facebook, the guys in San Francisco, they've said, work from home until next summer. Do not come back. And New York and LA and New York, you had no choice, and that's a financial district. So the financial district would have shut down if the staff from Wall Street weren't able to work at home. So the culture has been there, and obviously the technology is there for those types of jobs, those higher end jobs to happen. And as we were saying, those from wealthier backgrounds, they have houses in the countryside and they retreated there. And there's been a trend towards this whole digital nomad thing as well. And some economies, understanding that short-term tourism is dead, at least for the foreseeable future, they've jumped on it. So, for example, Barbados, they know they are a popular Caribbean island, and they know, okay, short stay is dead. So they introduce a 1-year visa, come for 1 year. And within a month, they had over 1,000 applicants from the US and from the UK. And of course, Portugal has benefited from that as well, because, in the digital nomad space, since Bali has been shut down, Chiang Mai, Medellin in Colombia, there are a lot of people here, and as in thousands of people. We had an online webinar for US taxes for those resident in Portugal. So I teamed up with my Portugal tax colleague, and within 2 weeks we had about 250 RSVPs, and we just put it on a website. So, and the government of Portugal, as Estonia and some other European countries, they have been pushing visas for independent workers, freelancers, and making it relatively easier, assuming that you come from a certain country, of course, to set up shop here, register to pay taxes, and get things done from an immigration perspective. So I agree with you that it's not, I don't think anyone can say this is a global trend, but definitely for certain categories of workers, obviously the more privileged workers with university degrees, and they're doing some sort of online, based job, and those who come from a wealthy country as well. So their passport gives them mobility. And apparently from the Anglo-Saxon world, where the companies and the culture lends itself to that. It seems as if it's definitely picking up. Bermuda has also jumped on that board. They have a 9-month visa and they're selling pitches. It's a shorter flying time from Bermuda to New York than if you had to drive from the Hamptons back into the city. So, destinations out of, just being purely selfish, I think they're going to benefit from it.
But thinking in a post-pandemic world, teleworking from any point of the world has to be a little more than that. Has to be hiring anyone in the world.
Oh, yeah.
So you're thinking that someone from New York is hired by a company from New York and will work in another country. But the interesting part of teleworking will be the company in New York hiring people that are from Barbados and live in Barbados and do their life in Barbados to do the work.
Definitely, it is transformative. So
so it's not people traveling deciding I'm going to move my house with me to somewhere else and keep my ties to the work. No, it's me working for that company without moving from my home. I don't need to go to the United States ever because I'm working from here and I'm producing for that company.
Yeah, and that's definitely a trend I see. Again, my exposures to the Anglo-Saxon world. So whereas previously we were exploring the supply chain and the supply chain story, which to a large extent has been a centerpiece to this pandemic, where you had borders closed and ports closed, and you had shortages of material, you have shortages of food in some places and you still have that.
Products, everyone noticed that some products, not the basic ones, but are missing or are reduced because you're not able to produce because factories are closed or something else.
Exactly. Whereas I see the opposite happening with services. So, obviously we know, at least in the English-speaking world, the impact that India has had on what we call BPO, business process outsourcing. So for example, I'm a tax professional. One of the recruiter in London was telling me that there's a succession crisis facing tax practices in the US. Why? Because traditionally, young people would graduate from certain universities and they will go into one of the big accounting firms and they will get like additional training. And those young people, very few of them would stay with the big accounting firm. They'll go into smaller accounting firms. So these big accounting firms were like the training ground for smaller accounting firms. Now those same big accounting firms, they no longer hire domestically. This is one of those open secrets. Everyone in the practice world knows that it's happening. A huge chunk of the returns are done in India, which means that we know that Microsoft, for example, switching to technology, they have as many employees or slightly more employees in India than they do in the US. Same with many of the accounting firms. They have many more tax professionals being hired in India to do US work or to do UK tax work than onshore, which means that they are no longer the training ground, which means that those smaller firms that depended on the graduates from the big firms, they're struggling to find talent. Which of course is a great story for emerging markets like India, like the Philippines. And I've seen it. So I've been based in Singapore for the past 7 years, as I think I mentioned. And for probably 4 of those years, every month I would spend about a week or so in Manila, in the Philippines. And I've seen firsthand that transformation where you have a whole middle class. A surprise to Westerners is that the biggest so-called ghettos in Asia aren't in India. They're actually in Manila, in the Philippines. and there's a lot of poverty, and it is sometimes surprising for Westerners to see it firsthand. But in the midst of that, you have this thriving middle class driven by BPOs, driven by young people who go to work at night, and you see them. So there's a rush hour in the evening, people going into the offices at night, the lights are all on in those tall buildings, and they're working with the West at night. And I mean, they're being paid a fraction of what the domestic US workers will be paid, but it's still a lot for the Philippines, and they're providing a great life for themselves and their families. So to me, at least in my anecdotal experience, it is already happening. And with the rise in artificial intelligence and therefore translation software, it means it's not only going to be an India, Philippines story, it's also becoming a Vietnam, Cambodia story as well, Thailand story, a Thai story, especially in terms of technology. Apple has well, before the pandemic, they announced a multi-million-dollar investment in Indonesia for programming talent because English speaking is no longer a barrier thanks to technology. So my point is that I agree with you, and it may still be in its infancy, relatively speaking, but it is definitely happening, and huge regions of large countries are being lifted out of poverty precisely because of that. And Mumbai, look at what's going on in Mumbai, right? It's a great story, and I think that as these Western companies still are under pressure to manage their cost base because, you know, of the challenges we're facing, they'll probably look to outsourcing to technology, first of all, because you have AI, you have algorithms, you have machine learning. But aside from that, I no longer have to be limited when I'm hiring. Me personally, I have team in India, I have guys in the US, Philippines, and of course Singapore and Indonesia. And that's just my personal team. So when I want something done, I wanted something specific done on my website, I wasn't limited to the best person in Singapore. I can look for the best person in the world to do this little thing on my website. And that is empowering. That is empowering, not just to me as a practice owner, but to the employees as well. You're right. You no longer have to immigrate to the US. In the interview that I did on my podcast last week, I interviewed a young lady based in the Philippines. She's working for one of the largest banks in Canada. She's never been to Canada, but she's supporting the infrastructure along with a team. And that's an amazing story, I think.
And yet, we think nationalism is rising. See, you just told a story about something that has happened in the recent 4 years that everyone is speaking. Where we just spoke now that supply chains are ending, they're being more local post-pandemic. But here we're seeing a supply chain. They were predicting that it's going to be more open.
Exactly. So it does seem like a paradox. In terms of the trade of goods, protectionism will be a challenge. I mean, globalization won't retreat, but the challenge would be protectionism. Trade, tariffs and non-tariff barriers, trade wars, it's not going to go away. But on the other side, the trade of services will be hyper-globalized. Because now the Wi-Fi, everyone says, at least the ones that
it's a big amount of money flow.
Yeah, services, especially for
you're going to increase the cash flow, although it may appear that you're going to reduce movement of goods or something like that.
It depends on what you're doing, right? So if I'm a manufacturer, maybe I'm Apple. So a lot of what I do is I make expensive phones. And my biggest manufacturer is a guy called Foxconn in China. Maybe I'm a bit worried right now that this trade war will, get worse, and my supply chain will be disrupted, and I can't get my phones into the US. But if I was running a service company, maybe I'm Microsoft, and I don't make phones really, not anymore. I tried, but didn't work. And I'm having access to all these brilliant programmers in India. That's amazing. I'm happy. So it depends on which side of the equation you are. You could be very happy or you could be very nervous, I think.
So I think digitalization were spoken.
Yeah.
Traveling, we spoke about what type of security checks
Yeah.
would happen from now on. But I think with COVID, post-pandemic, it would be only health checks that would have some kind of
I agree. Yeah.
change. Politically, we already talked about supply chains, about protectionism. We didn't spoke about who pays the debt. It's also a big subject that is talked about in this post-pandemic world. Is we're going to create debt, so private entities are public or outside from the country. Other public entities are going to pay. Are going to give us, to loan us some money, are going to have to pay. So who is going to pay this increase in debt?
That is a great question. And the answer is singular. Salaried workers. Because most tax systems that I'm aware of, they work in favor of business owners and to the disadvantage of people who earn a wage. Because if you own a business, you have a lot more flexibility and the tax code tends to be in your favor. Whereas if you're in a salary, you can't do anything. It is what it is. So some countries are able to just print money and not have to deal with a lot of inflation. And some countries print or borrow and they deal with inflation. So I'm thinking of like extreme examples, Zimbabwe, Venezuela. Crazy inflation, right? They run the printing presses and things get crazy. But then on the other side of the spectrum, you have the ECB and you have the Fed that are able to do quantitative easing, which is essentially the same thing. You're printing money, but you seem to have the ability to somehow, yes, there's inflation, but it doesn't go crazy. Right. And when you have inflation, again, in that situation, what we've seen, at least in the US, a market I'm more familiar with, we have seen, yes, asset inflation, but in a way, again, that disproportionately benefits wealthy people because it's a stock market, right? You've seen what's going on in the shares in Tesla, in Apple, in Netflix, blah, 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 Amazon, whatever. It's crazy. Snowflake last week, that crazy IPO. That's not the regular guy or lady working in McDonald's. These are more highly compensated professionals who have invested in the stock market, who own the factors of production, and they are able to benefit, at least at this point, from the higher returns caused by arguably greater liquidity. Whereas the regular salaried persons, they who have no control over the factors of production. So in short, as to the question, who pays? I think all things being equal, assuming that it's done in a strategic way that doesn't lead to a near collapse like we've seen like in an Argentina or Zimbabwe or crazy Venezuela. I think who pays will be the lower income earners. All things being equal, I know it's a broad statement, varies by whatever. What are your thoughts?
Since the 2008-2011 crisis, Portugal did a very interesting thing, which always makes me question this debt story. To what extent are you really thinking with all the players and how they are playing? So we were an indebted country. Our friends and partners in IMF, in the European Union, and in the European Central Bank, friends and partners, because we're a part of those institutions. Okay, so we have to be honest with who we are dealing. They decided, yeah, you're a cool guy, you know, we're going to support you on this, but you give us some money back. And something starting appearing in within the public system, which were funds. You know, funds to save the banks, funds for social security protection in the long term, so that we won't run out of money, funds for individual pensions. So they used to say we have a contributive pension system, which hasn't changed except for some minor details. And they created a pension fund, a private one, a public one, I'm sorry. So you have the privates, which generally are linked with insurance companies or with banks or both. And they created a public one. So as a private investor, you know, those funds generally go and see the market. They have more risk, less risk, blah, blah, blah. Well, I decided, you know what? I think that a public fund, it's a very interesting idea, you know, because it's individual. It's what I put there, which I don't think should replace the contributive system, in which we help each other out. So, but the fact that we have an individual, I can put some extra money there, and it's, if I die, it doesn't disappear. You know? It's not contributive. It's something that my family inherits, so I can lend to them if I don't benefit it. I thought it was a very interesting idea, and I subscribed it. So I have that. Since it was created within the first months, I immediately adhere to it. You know, maybe it's Portuguese, it's cultural. We like this public stuff. That fund invests almost entirely in Portuguese public debt.
Okay.
So when that debt is paid, actually, I'm going to benefit from it for my retirement.
Okay.
For my family. So this new source of investor, which is public funds, who are clearly made to buy public debt, you know, I think they're not being well analyzed. We have to start being inside this equation, because after the crisis of 2008, in Portugal at least, they start popping out like little rabbits, you know, everywhere. Funds for this, funds for that, but what are those funds investing in? And at the same time, suddenly you start seeing, yeah, public debt is good. Everyone's investing. And to what point, at what state is public funds, which the purpose was to create some kind of pillow, so there wouldn't be difficulty in paying other type of payments needed to, according to what they were made to, the purpose, are not really the secret behind this indebtedness that we can maintain and reduce the amount of it.
So, sorry.
To what point the European Union is going to send that 730 million euros debt scheme to give to the countries? To what point are not the public services of those countries going to be the ones buying that debt to then receive it back?
That's interesting, because that's and it sounds like an effective way of creating that that cushion, as you say, without creating inflation, right? But then I wonder, back to my economics days about crowding out, right? Because a lot of the economic growth comes from, that innovation, uh, productivity being increased because of, leveraging factors of production. And I'm thinking that if for young people in like the Anglo-Saxon world, if you are a small business person, I'm not talking about a big company, and you're looking for initial funding, there's right now there are like networks of angel investors and stuff like that, which provide that liquidity needed to early stage companies. So I'm not saying that this is an answer. I'm curious to see to what extent does like it becomes like a vacuum cleaner in Portugal. It's vroom, and it's just sucking up all that available liquidity. And the opportunity cost is that young entrepreneur in Lisbon who has a great idea for who knows what may find it slightly more difficult to raise capital if capital is being funded that way. And
No, because if you take the public debt out of the market,
yeah,
the market is going to invest in private debt.
but you're saying that you yourself are contributing to a fund, which in turn contributes into debt, right?
So
Yeah.
I'm investing
Yeah.
in retirement, like everyone, most people in
Yeah.
the Anglo-Saxon world do.
Sure.
They invest in a fund, and that fund mostly invests in public debt.
Now, in the Anglo-Saxon world is different in that most retirement funds invest in equities. So,
No, right. For me, as a person,
right.
the same invest in a private fund, but this fund specifically, just like many others that are managed by public institutions, invests in public debt.
Yeah.
Taking it out of the market increases competition, so the prices are lower, but also takes it out of the market, creating more space for private debt.
Exactly. So what I'm saying is that, and again, I'm not saying that this is good or bad. It's just an observation that when you look at the average portfolio for the retirement fund of the average person in the US, or to a large extent, also in the US, you have 401ks and Roth retirement funds. And in the UK, the preferred vehicle for pension planning is an ISA. They tend to be disproportionately skewed towards equities. So they buy shares in companies as opposed to public sector debt. Well, public sector debt will, of course, be very safe, right? Safe, low yield, but very safe and prudent. But again, perhaps it's a cultural distinction where there's a greater appetite for risk. So because a lot of people felt pain earlier this year when the pandemic happened and their pension funds collapsed. But a little bit, it may have come up a little bit. So I don't know, who knows? So I'm just saying that, okay, it's risky, but what that means is that if I were a young Mark Zuckerberg and I had this idea for face something, it would be easier, relatively speaking. I know it's a very broad thing, that to find investors who are willing to take a risk to invest equity into my face thing idea, then potentially it would be where in Lisbon, if I'm understanding you correctly, where investors are more conservative and more prudent, and they prefer the low risk and the safety of debt as opposed into something, investing into something which could be very big or it could collapse and disappear tomorrow. So just curious.
So, but there is no data on this.
Yeah.
I can't really tell you it's huge enough.
Yeah.
It might be relevant in the scheme of things.
Okay.
Okay, so last point, then I have the individual perceptions. But last point is the economics. How are we going to look at economics? Because although personally, I do believe that comparative economics has too few indicators, and I understand why, because it's hard to have indicators that are comparable, that are measuring truly the same thing.
Yep.
I sense that bad results
Mhm.
tend to make people look in different perspectives.
Mhm.
So maybe if for a long period of time, because after 2008 we didn't see this happen, okay? But maybe if the crisis lasts for a certain period of time with bad results, then finally we'll start evaluating economies with more indicators than just GDP, and do it officially, in happily, with this new step. Maybe we can make that evolution,
Yeah,
make things more comparable.
I agree with you. And I think that idea of comparability of data kind of popped out at me a few months ago, like when the pandemic first started. And I was trying to understand the differences in infection and mortality in different European countries and with the UK and with the US. And I remember reading something from a professor at Stanford University in the US, and he says, don't even try. The methodologies are so different that it's useless. It's useless to try. And it's not just with the disease, but just general employment, per capita income, all those things are just inflation. The baskets of goods are so different. The cultures are different. So I agree with you. It's quite difficult right now, but hopefully in time, it perhaps will be easier. Yeah.
Okay. So finally,
Yeah.
this was totally unexpected. So individual perception. So I was gathered with some friends and I just said this post-pandemic world. Tell me your thoughts. And I took some notes.
Okay.
And I thought this was a good way to be a little bit in touch and run away from all these things I had gathered from several opinion makers, several entities, and I had some good ideas, some catching phrases.
Yeah.
The first one was, we all live in a post-pandemic world.
Okay.
So this is an historical idea. We've been through several post-pandemic situations. And in none of them, the world changed.
To the extent, I agree with that, to the extent that some people say the only constant is change. The only constant is change. Things are always changing. So whether it's because of a pandemic, because of a war, because of some elected leader, because of a new invention, things are always changing. So what else is new, right?
Like you said, with the Spanish flu, they closed theaters, they closed this, they closed that. They all open again. Maybe with different names, maybe by different companies, with different prices, but the world continued the same.
Indeed.
So the past taught us there is no post-pandemic world. There is a period in time where we're all bugged up with this, and then we live our lives.
Indeed.
So the world is the same. And with this sentence, the idea was, it's the same world. Why would there be some change? Some change that comes from a pandemic virus if the rest of the world remains the same. So you don't have, like you've spoken before, there's no different redistribution of resources. Things work the same way. I still have to press the same button. So the pandemic itself did not bring any new light on any subject, except perhaps public health. So this is an interesting idea also, that people are not expecting change. And if you're not expecting, you're not going to be an agent of, you're not going to promote it.
Mm-hmm.
Also, not everyone agrees with the vaccine.
True. True. Yeah.
This idea is very important. This not agreeing with the vaccine has so many things behind it
Mm.
that can be relevant or not for a post-pandemic world.
Mm.
First, the concept that it's post-pandemic after the vaccine.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Because when I have a vaccine, I don't need to worry more about this.
Mm-hmm.
So this is the true expectation about the vaccine.
Mm-hmm.
So, but the fact not everyone agrees, maybe
Mm-hmm.
not everyone agrees with which vaccine to choose.
Mm-hmm.
Which vaccine is the best?
Mm-hmm.
And this has a lot to do with the reaction individuals, of course this also has to do with culture, will have towards the vaccine.
Mm-hmm.
And some questions that arose was, will the vaccine have any long-term consequences for the individual?
Mm-hmm.
And the persons that ask this
Mm-hmm.
are simply medicine consumers.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so they're not anti-vaxxers.
Mm-hmm.
There are people who have consumed medicine, they have had bad experiences, or they had
Mhm.
family members with bad experiences.
Yeah.
They think,
Mm-hmm.
if I want to take medication, it could be a new food, it could be a new fruit, you know?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I want to be sure
Mm-hmm.
about the consequences they're going to have. And these people, although they are in favor of vaccination, they're not going to consume the vaccine,
Mm-hmm.
or they even want to choose what vaccine they will have access to
Mm-hmm.
or when to take it.
Mm-hmm.
For how long does it work?
Yeah.
Will it be mandatory for traveling?
Oh, of course.
Interesting.
Yeah.
It's interesting because they did not state, will it be mandatory here in Portugal?
Yeah.
No, that wasn't the question.
Mm-hmm.
Will it be mandatory for traveling?
Mm-hmm.
So this idea, there will be one world.
Mm-hmm.
We generally state a part of the world will have access to the vaccine,
Mm-hmm.
part of the world won't have easy access to the vaccine. I would split it in another way, which is a part of the world will want the vaccine,
Mm-hmm.
another part of the world won't want the vaccine.
Yeah.
And this split, this gap,
Mm-hmm.
can be
Mm-hmm.
extremely spaced and increase within those post-pandemic worlds.
Mm-hmm.
So if for some reason post-pandemic does not finish after the vaccine, this, I'm
Mm-hmm.
going to blame those. If for some reason almost everyone gets vaccinated and still there's a post-pandemic world, but there is debt or there is something more, they are going to blame those
Mm-hmm.
because they paid for the vaccination and it was useless. Blah, blah. So I can see all these movements, opinions, people of groups of friends avoiding discussing vaccination and simply judging you. They can ask you, did you make the vaccine?
Mm-hmm.
Did you make the right vaccine? No, I heard this.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because I traveled to somewhere else.
Mm-hmm.
And in that country, everyone from that country, the vaccine they made worked. People from our country that made the same vaccine and from Spain did not work. See, so our vaccine was different from theirs. But because there was a coincidence in a group of people
Mm-hmm.
that,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, vaccination is going to be a big issue on opinion making.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Already is, I know, but
Mm-hmm.
oh, I love that one.
Yeah.
There is a cold war for vaccination.
Yeah. Agreed.
What if
Mm-hmm.
a Chinese vaccine
Mm-hmm.
is scientifically the best vaccine?
Yeah.
What if?
Yeah.
Are we going to have the best vaccine? Or are we going to not have the Chinese vaccine because it's Chinese?
Mhm.
What's going to be more relevant? The market, the better option? Or
Well,
is it going to be the political option?
yeah, and I guess we've seen a taste of that with Huawei. With their allegedly their technology is superior with 5G, but they're being blocked out of the Western world for political reasons.
So are we going to be blocked from the best vaccine because it's Chinese?
Yeah.
And finally, the historical comparison,
Mm-hmm.
not with the Spanish flu, it's also mentioned,
Mm-hmm.
not with the swine flu, it's very little mentioned,
Mm-hmm.
but with HIV.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
Which is also something very present.
Yeah.
Although transmission, everything is, there's no similarity,
Mm-hmm.
but it's present there,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
you know? So we maybe
Mm-hmm.
it would be interesting to see if this scare, this excess in information, this over modeling
Mm-hmm.
has to do
Mm-hmm.
historically with what the HIV pandemic brought to humanity.
Mm-hmm. And to be fair, that is perhaps the most interesting comparison because we've just learned to live with HIV. It hasn't gone away, but it's no longer the headline because we have precautions, we have medication, I think, and we just live with it, you know? Yeah. It is a barrier because, like, if you want to immigrate somewhere or some places to get a work permit in another country, they do test for it. And if you don't pass the test, you're not let in. But aside from that, life just continues. So maybe, perhaps, maybe.
So, and we still don't have enough information
Mm-hmm.
to tell someone for sure 100%. Of course, it's not like HIV in
Mm-hmm.
the sense that, of course, you're not going to have it for life.
Mm-hmm.
So this scare
Mm-hmm.
is still hanging there,
Mm-hmm.
and it might hang around in post-pandemic world.
It will just never go away.
Those with COVID-19,
Mm-hmm.
that if they have some consequences,
Mm-hmm.
I imagine someone which had COVID-19,
Mm-hmm.
for some reason they kept difficulty breathing,
Yeah. Yeah.
and every time that gets worse, they
Mm-hmm.
will believe, even if everyone tells them you're cured,
Mm-hmm.
they'll still think, no, I still have it here with me.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's not gone.
Mm-hmm.
And this is going to be also present in the post-pandemic world.
Amazing. I completely agree with you. All distinct possibilities. It has been an amazing discussion, a tour de force. We've gone all over the world, approaching it from so many ideological perspectives. I'm grateful. Thank you for your time, Hugo.
Thank you for inviting me. It was fun. It was a pleasure to dedicate some time, not all of the time, I'm sorry, because this deserved more time, but dedicating some time on hearing different opinions
Mm-hmm.
and different things that were written and have been written on this, and trying to avoid personal opinions. So most of these
Mm-hmm.
topics are actually in discussion in
Yeah.
different media, different states.
Mm-hmm.
But if we want to think in the world, we have to look at them all.
Exactly. Keep an open mind.
Exactly.
Yeah. I remember reading somewhere that your mind is like a parachute. It works best when it's open. So on that note, thank you very much, Hugo.
Please subscribe, like, share, and comment below. Our books and upcoming event are available at htj.tax. Email us at help@htj.tax to engage us, to advise on international tax or business matters.